Welcome back to GridSmart Living. In today's video, we're talking about range anxiety, but I'm not going to say what everybody else on YouTube is saying right now about range anxiety, that it doesn't exist, it's not a thing anymore. You shouldn't worry about the range anymore because we've got pretty good range, all the way up to 400 to 450 miles of range for an EV. I'm here to say that is not true. So it's not going to be what everybody else is saying. I do think there are situations where an EV works and range anxiety is less of an issue. I'm going to talk about that. But range anxiety is absolutely still an issue. I'm going to explain why and under what circumstances an EV might not be the right fit for you, or at least you need to be aware of the different factors so that you can make an informed decision before you buy an EV and then have a lot of regrets after having made that purchase. Now, here's my disclaimer. It's currently April of 2026. If you're watching this and it's 2027, 2028, or 2030, it might not be as applicable. Right now, there is a ton of technology in China that is getting ready to go into production vehicles over there that will actually change a lot of these situations. For example, cold weather batteries. They've got batteries over there that are going into production vehicles right now or early next year that don't lose range in cold climate. You can be down to negative 30 degrees and you have a very small, if at all, any kind of a battery loss or range loss because of the temperature. So that will have a dramatic impact on this analysis for cold weather situations specifically, if that battery was to make it over to the US. Plus, they're also building batteries that have much longer ranges. So we're talking 600, 700, 800-mile range batteries in China. Plus, they're also developing charging that is far faster than anything that is currently available in the US, or even being planned to be rolled out here in the US. So all of those things in the future will obviously change these factors. Just like the factors right now are different than they were 10, 15 years ago when EVs were first coming out. Right now, I would say that EVs have come a long way, but for a lot of the different situations for drivers in the US, they're still not quite where they need to be. Not to mention they're still kind of pricey in comparison to some other vehicles, although I would say they're really getting close to the same cost of a regular internal combustion engine, or they're very similar in cost to hybrid vehicles. All right, so now that we've covered the short disclaimer there, let's go ahead and jump right in. So this is what we're going to cover in today's video, and essentially we're going to talk about range anxiety, what is rated range versus your usable range, EV versus a gas comparison, and then just kind of the situations where EVs don't work great and then where EVs do work great. And then we're going to talk about a checklist of sorts for whether an EV is a good fit for your lifestyle. And then we're just going to, kind of wrap things up at the end there. So that's kind of the main focus of today's video, is to talk about these different areas. And of course, if you don't know, I like the Rivian product. I'm looking at getting an Rivian R2, so I'm going to use that as an example here, but I've also been considering getting a Rivian R1S. Again, full disclaimer, I don't have an EV right now, but I've spent a few years looking at getting one. The Rivians are the first ones that came out that I was really interested in getting. I'm an SUV person. I love having SUVs. The Rivian R1S is actually the perfect size for having 3 golden retrievers. I think that will work great for having such large dogs, giving them some space. But I like the idea of the Rivian R2's back window being able to go down, and I can kind of put that down and they can put their heads out the back. So I really like the idea of the Rivian R2. So I've been holding off on making a purchase while I kind of wait for the R2 to become available, and then I can actually open it up and take a look at it and see if that will work better than, say, the Rivian R1S. Plus, I'm also not a huge SUV person as far as like size. I don't necessarily need R1S size for my lifestyle. It's just the dogs, and I think that the Rivian R2 will probably fit there. So most of the calculations that I'm going to use inside this video are going to be around the Rivian R2 range of around 330 miles. So what is rated range versus your usable range? Now, the Rivian R2 has a rated range of around 330 miles, but most of the time you don't charge beyond 80%. Now, if you're doing a road trip or something like that, yes, you can charge it to 100%. When you're driving, if you're trying to get to 100%, just keep in mind that it takes a lot longer to go from 80% to 100% than to go from, say, 60% to 80%. So even on a road trip, a lot of times, unless you really have nothing else you have to do and you're not just waiting for the vehicle to charge, you could wait for it to get all the way to 100%. But if you're one of those people that like to just get in the vehicle and drive and drive and drive and drive, and maybe you eat, and I was this person a long time ago, I did exactly this. I would drive 600, 700, 800 miles just nonstop. I would drive 24 hours straight. I would have the food, chips, whatever snacks I wanted, and then I have a very minimal amount of liquids, so I didn't have to stop and use the restroom all the time. I was that person. So for me, 15, 20 years ago, an EV would definitely not have worked for my lifestyle on how long it would drive and different things we would do. But you have a daily charge limit of around 80%, and then you want to have a reserve of a certain percentage. And this percentage varies. You could have it go all the way down to 10%. Regular driving, typically they recommend somewhere between 20 and 25%. You don't want to have that deep discharge all the way down to 10% or lower very frequently. So a good planning factor is usually want to keep it between 25 and 80%. Now this is actually very similar to a gas vehicle. Normally you don't want to drive your vehicle below a quarter of a tank. So essentially 25%. It's very similar for an EV. So it's got kind of the same planning factor. The difference being is it's very easy to fill up your gas vehicle all the way to 100% on a road trip or some other event where you need maximum. You don't typically go to a certain percentage of full, you go to a full tank of gas. So that is a little bit of a difference, but there is some similarities between a gas vehicle and an EV. But this means that you basically have 55% of usable range. That's very different from 333 miles. Now we're talking about 182 miles of range is what you would expect from a Rivian R2. Very, very different, right? And this is why I say that range anxiety is absolutely a real thing, depending on how you're using the vehicle and what you're trying to do with the vehicle. So when you're buying an EV, you have to take into consideration the usable range of that vehicle. Now, similarly, when you're buying a gas vehicle, you normally realize that you have to start filling up that car, especially if you're on a long road trip, around the time that you hit a quarter of a tank. So from a planning perspective, it's not much different on a road trip. Just keep in mind that unless you're starting in at 100%, you're already starting lower than what your gas counterpart vehicle would be starting at. This is why I say there's a big difference between your rated range and your usable range. So let's do a comparison between an EV and a gas vehicle. Again, both 330-mile range. And this is why I say range anxiety is definitely not fake. It is a true issue depending on what you're trying to do with the vehicle. Now, again, we have our usable ranges, right? So we've got 182 miles here. That's typically from that 80 to 25%, like we just discussed a second ago. But then you go to cold weather, and all of a sudden in cold weather, you lose about 30%. So you're down to around 127 miles. And I know people are going to say in the comments that these are all fictitious numbers and you don't actually lose 30%. Yes, that is around what people lose depending on how cold it is. And actually, when it's really, really cold out there, like I grew up in Wisconsin and it would be negative 25 degrees sometimes driving around in Wisconsin, you might lose 40% or more of your battery range just because of the cold weather. So now I'm at 109 miles of range. This wouldn't have worked at some jobs that I've been at where I had round trip but on a daily basis of around 100 miles. So I would have range anxiety every single day that I would have been going to work had I had an EV at those times. And then you add towing. And towing, again, you're losing around 40% of your range. So you're, again, down to about 109 miles, about as bad as it is with severe cold weather. And then if you put it together, you're down to 65 miles. So if you're living in Wisconsin where it's maybe negative 25 degrees out there and you're trying to tow at the same time, you might only have 65 miles of range for your vehicle, and then you got to go charge it up again. So if you do a lot of towing or you have long distance and you're in cold weather, an EV is absolutely right now not a great option for you for that use case. But let's say we compare it to a gas vehicle. Gas vehicles also lose some of their range when they're towing and during cold weather. But again, they're still, on the worst case, cold weather, severe cold weather, and towing, you're still looking at around 129 miles of range. And what makes this all much, much worse is the amount of time it takes to charge your vehicle. It takes you around 5-ish minutes to fill up your gas vehicle. It could take you anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour or longer to charge up your EV. And yes, there's a strong argument that you're going to be doing other things while you're doing that. But again, not everybody is doing all those other things. Somebody like me that's a little bit older, has already done all those things and likes to kind of take their time and go eat or maybe go look around the rest stop or wherever I'm at. Yeah, I can sit there and not have to wait for an EV to charge. I can be doing other things. But if you're one of those people that likes to get in, get their gas and get on to the next step or keep moving, maybe they're waiting for the end of the day or they're trying to get to someplace before it's dark out. Whatever the use case is, there are people that do that all the time. And a 65-mile range followed by a 30-minute to 60-minute charge session just to get another 65 miles is definitely not going to work for you. And you're not going to be happy with the purchase of your EV if you don't understand this going into that purchase. That's why for range anxiety, it's not just the range anxiety, it's also how long does it take to charge your vehicle? And this is why I spend a lot of time focusing on why are manufacturers not doing higher voltage charging? Why are they not pushing for infrastructure that supports faster charging? Those things help fix some of these issues. And fortunately for us, we've got China that's pushing really hard to build better battery technology that eventually we'll have access to here in the US. I don't think that'll be for another 5 to 10 years, but it's coming. So this issue that we're seeing here is not going to be as much of an issue in the future, just like it was a much bigger issue, again, 10 years ago when EVs were first starting out. So what situations is range anxiety absolutely warranted? I would say if you don't have access to home charging, it's definitely something you need to consider is the impact of that. Because at the end of the day, I have a house, I can come back here and I can plug it into the house without any problems. If you live in an apartment, you live in a townhouse, you live in some sort of a multi-occupancy type unit, and you don't have access to easy home charging, then you're constantly having to find someplace else to charge your vehicle. Maybe you've got it next to where you work. Maybe you have it someplace close where it's not much of an issue. But at the end of the workday, if your vehicle is always at empty, maybe you use most of your range every day when you're working, you're not going to want to sit at a supercharger every single day charging up your vehicle. And again, that would be an example of a situation where an EV is probably not the right fit for you. Maybe you're a student at college. There's not a ton of charging capabilities on campuses right now. So an EV is probably not going to work for college students. And again, this is that generational issue. There are certain generations that just are not going to have a good experience with an EV because they're in apartments, they're in dorms, they're in townhouses, they're just getting started. They don't have a house. And then there's the cold weather, right? So if you're in a cold weather climate, it's definitely going to impact your ability to drive longer distances. So you have to consider how much range you're going to lose with your cold weather situation. And if you do a lot of towing, and I don't think that this is something that everybody has, maybe towing's a one-off, they do it once in a while, but there are some people that tow quite a lot. If you're towing a lot and you're in cold weather, you might not be a good candidate to get an EV yet. Maybe you have a high mileage job. You're technicians, you're doing lots of trips to fix things. And then maybe you're just doing like rideshare type stuff, Uber drivers and that kind of stuff. Well, if you're driving hundreds of miles per day because of all your different trips and you're doing a lot of city driving, so your range isn't always as good as, say, doing on the highway, then you might have to do a couple different charge sessions per day. That's all time that either extends your day because you're trying to get a certain number of trips in, and maybe you're spending a lot of time sitting at a supercharger. And again, if we had faster charging and better charging infrastructure, this would be less of an issue. If you could go and charge in and be done charging in 5 to 10 minutes, you wouldn't worry about it. But when you have 30 minutes to an hour of sitting there waiting for your vehicle to charge, this is absolutely an issue that you have to consider. Now, if you're somebody that does a lot of road trips, and again, I was one of these people that did a lot of road trips, you're going to have to factor in how much time you spend waiting for the vehicle. And maybe you're a little bit older like me and you don't have a problem. You go in, you get something to eat, get something to drink from a coffee, and then you come back out. And your vehicle's typically around being fully charged at that point, so it's less of an issue. But if you're like the younger version of me, where you would normally just stop, get gas, and get right back on the road, that's not going to be your experience with an EV right now. Maybe you're doing a lot of rural driving, or you're in states where there isn't a lot of charging infrastructure. There are some states where there might not be a charger for hundreds of miles. That is an issue. You need to have access to EV charging, especially if you don't have it at your house or you don't have it at your apartment. Most of our cities, I think these days, have some sort of charging capability, but it's not as much in certain states as in other states. If you're in California, you're pretty much set. Everywhere in that state, there is charging infrastructure everywhere. But some of the other states don't have as much, especially the more agricultural states where it's more spread out. There's not as much charging capability there. And then there's always the emergency or the unplanned trips that pop up. Now, these are a little bit more sporadic, and you're going to have to evaluate your situation. If you're in an area where there isn't a lot of charging and you haven't got your vehicle charged, this could be a serious issue. Maybe you don't have ambulance access, or it's maybe 45 minutes to an hour, and typically people would be driving. If your vehicle is drained at the time that an emergency happens, that could be a life-threatening situation that you have to work through. Now, am I saying that these are all the situations where you absolutely can't have an EV? Absolutely not. These are the situations where you might have to put a little bit more thought into whether an EV is going to work for your situation. Not having a home charger is not a deal breaker for every single situation. Here's an interesting thought on that also. Maybe right now you live in an apartment, you live in a townhouse, and you've got a great job, and an EV will work. You've got charging capability maybe at your job or nearby, or you've got enough miles where you can get to and from, and then you can just charge at the Walmart chargers that are coming right now. That might work for you. What if you move and change jobs, or something changes and where you move to doesn't have it? So an EV might work where you are right now, but it might not work where you might live in the future. I spent a lot of time moving around the country and internationally. So there are people that have that kind of, they're constantly moving with their jobs. It might work great here, but maybe the EV won't work in future areas. But the key thing is I'm not saying that these are all deal breakers. You absolutely can't get an EV. What I'm saying is that you need to think through these and figure out how it's going to impact your life based off these factors. I mean, you can live in Wisconsin and have negative 30-degree weather and still have an EV if your job doesn't require lots of driving. You're not driving a ton of miles every single day. Or you've got chargers where you're going to be working, and then you've got a charger at home. So maybe you do have 65-mile range and it will still work. Or maybe you have a 100-mile range that will still work for you. So these aren't necessarily deal breakers. These are the situations where range anxiety definitely plays a role. Some of it can be mitigated and sometimes it can't. And if it can't, then maybe an EV is not the right fit for you right now. So when is EV range anxiety less of an issue? Home charging fixes a lot of issues. So if you just have access to home charging, that can make everything work. Also, if you've got access to backup charging options, that can be helpful. So for example, when you get to your work, maybe you've already got charging that's there, you can charge up your vehicle and it's less of an issue. That makes a huge difference in what will work and what isn't going to work. Maybe you've got a very predictable driving pattern and it's a very small commute. Now, I typically don't have to do a lot of driving. So in my situation, all of these factors actually work. I have a house. I have a very small commute requirement. Most of my driving is within my local range. I don't do a lot of road trips. I don't do a lot of towing. Virginia weather is typically not super cold, so it's not a huge factor there. So for me, most of these situations work well in my situation. But maybe your situation isn't like that. Maybe you match up with some of the situations where it's just not a good fit. Now, again, I'm not saying that EVs don't work. What I'm saying is that in certain circumstances, they work much, much better than in other circumstances. I tend to think most YouTube channels focus on all of these situations and never talk about any of the other situations. This is the kind of the ideal situation. This is not what everybody's situation is like. Now, I would say that for most people that can afford to buy, especially some of the more expensive EVs out there, this is generally what their lifestyle is like. It's not as crazy as when you're in your 20s and 30s. When you're in your 40s, 50s, and 60s, EVs make great vehicles because you have a house, you have access to home charging, you're typically not doing a lot of driving, you're not typically not doing a lot of road trips anymore. EVs work great. Not so much for, say, a teenager or somebody straight out of high school, in college, getting set up. EVs don't always work for those situations because you, again, don't have a home, you don't have access to home charging, and just about everything else could be kind of going against buying an EV. So range anxiety definitely fits in those situations. In this kind of a setup here, it definitely is less of a factor. Range anxiety is not a huge issue. And I tend to think that some people that make a huge issue out of range anxiety that are also in this situation, they might be looking at it through the lens of when they were much, much younger and not applying their current reality to the situation. But again, I don't know everybody's situation. This is just how I interpret it. So I created a checklist to help you kind of understand your situation before you buy an EV. And the charging access is kind of the major one. So I start there. Can I charge at home? Do I have reliable chargers nearby? Am I okay with waiting 20 to 40 minutes during longer trips when I have to do road trips and that kind of stuff? And then your driving reality. What is the longest normal driving day? What is the worst normal driving day? Do I drive in winter, tow? Do you have to drive for work? And do you rely on highway driving? I always have to kind of consider the emergency circumstances. Again, if you're living in one of those more rural states where you don't have an emergency room right there, maybe with ambulance support, emergency services, then you definitely want to consider the impact for the unexpected. And a great example is maybe you're in a Uber driver, or you're in some sort of a job that drives all day, and you get home at the end of the day and your vehicle is virtually empty, not a lot of battery left, and you typically charge it during time of use. So you charge it at like midnight to 6 so that you use your time use rates. That's a pretty common approach in, say, like California, where electricity is incredibly expensive. You charge during the nighttime hours so you don't impact your bill as much. Well, what if there's an emergency right after you get home and you got to get to the emergency room? And maybe it's not the emergency that requires an ambulance and you could just kind of take them there. What if your EV is not charged and that's the only vehicle that you've got and it's currently empty? And this is where planning for emergencies is also important. If you drain your battery down and you don't have enough range to get through an emergency situation, you're going to hate an EV and you're going to be blaming an EV, even though you might have done some planning and kind of figured this out ahead of time. Where is the hospital? Where is kind of what the emergencies that I would have to leave the house to go do something? How much range do I need to do that? And make sure you have a vehicle that has that minimum amount of range for emergency circumstances. Again, you could have the same issue with a gas vehicle where maybe it's on E and you bring it home and you plan on filling it up before your workday the next day or on the way to your job or whatever. This same situation can happen to a gas vehicle. So this isn't something that is EV specific. It's just a planning reality. But I kind of feel these are the key things to consider when you're looking at getting an EV. As far as your lifestyle and your situation, there are obviously a lot of other things about the EV you should consider, but these are the key things from a perspective of your lifestyle and whether an EV will fit into your lifestyle or whether your lifestyle is going to have to fit in with an EV. Well, that's pretty much it for this video. We're hitting the summary here. Now, don't forget, if you like this kind of content, hit that like and subscribe. It does help the channel grow. So we talked about a lot of stuff here. And the key takeaway is EV range anxiety is not fake. It is math, time, infrastructure, weather, and driving habits all coming together. For some people, that equation works great. For others, it still doesn't. When you're looking at an EV, obviously you take a look at your range, but don't forget about the usable range and kind of factor in what is the usable range going to be for you with that vehicle at where you are given all the different factors. Generally, these are the areas that range anxiety feels worse, is if any of these factors play a role in your situation. And if you're in this situation, then you're not going to have as many range anxiety issues, or you shouldn't have as many real range anxiety issues. If you're looking at your situation through a lifestyle that existed 20 years ago, then the range anxiety is something that existed 20 years ago and may not apply to your current situation. And then obviously before you buy, make sure you understand all the different aspects of your situation, because ideally you're trying to put an EV into your lifestyle, not a lifestyle into the EV. If it's the latter, you're not going to like your EV because you're going to constantly have to adjust your lifestyle to make the EV work in that. That's it for today. Until next time.